Good afternoon, everybody, to the thousands watching live on Zoom and the millions watching on YouTube. Welcome, everybody, to Lunch and Learn. It's wonderful to have you all back. I know I've been away for a couple of weeks from the camera, but we're back now, and it's lovely to see you all. So we are going to talk a little bit. The way this works for all of our new listeners and viewers is we speak for a couple of minutes about the upcoming Torah portion, the Parashat of the week, and then we have a look at the ethics of the fathers, Pirkei, Avot, and we do a little bit of that as well. So this week's Parashat is called Shoftim. And I would say like this, it deals with the different kinds of leaders and the different kinds of protectors and role models that as a Jewish people we have in place. Our systems of leadership are very much discussed. And as we've mentioned before, the book of Devarim, these weeks that we are in now, are all taking place in the last 36 days of Moshe's life. And he is delivering his final messages to the Jewish people. And the Jewish people are all assembled and listening to everything that he's got to say. And he is preparing them for life in the land of Israel. And all of the things that they're going to face and the way that life is going to be. They've been in this spiritual bubble, in this spiritual incubator. They've had their food provided for free, their water provided for free. Their clothes have been growing on them and their shoes have been growing as they've gone through it. Nothing's worn out. It's all been living on miracles. But now, as they go into the land of Israel, it's going to be down to their own graft and their own hard work. So these weeks, these 11 Parashat in Devarim are all about the different facets and the different aspects of life that they are going to need to get adjusted to and get accommodated to once they go into the land of Israel. So this week, as I said, we're talking about the systems of leadership, or some of the systems of leadership that will be in place. So it talks about the courts of justice that will have to be established. And we have to make sure that all of our judges will be honest and God-fearing. And everything has to be above board. We're not allowed to accept bribery. We're not allowed to accept bribes. No bribery is allowed. We talk about the systems of witnesses that have to be processed when someone wants to testify about somebody else in court. That all gets discussed. We also discuss the concept of a Jewish king and how one day when the Jews are in the land of Israel settling down, they are going to demand to have a king appointed over them, and what has to happen when that occurs. So that all gets discussed. Interestingly, about kings, actually, an interesting thing about leadership in general. Leadership in Judaism doesn't mean that we find this guy and we put him on a pedestal and he is now free to do whatever he wants. The role of a leader in Judaism ultimately is to bring the best out of the subjects. Leadership is about the subjects, not about the leaders. So there's actually a lot of rules and commandments that a king has to follow that other people don't have to follow. They are not allowed to get too wealthy. They are not allowed to have too much stuff. They're not allowed to marry too many women. They are not allowed to indulge them. They're not allowed to have too many horses because it's not supposed to be about what they can get and what they can accumulate. It's about what they are able to give to the rest of the nation. So a very interesting take on leadership. They had a commandment that they had to write a Torah scroll. 2 Torah scrolls, one of which they would put aside in storage, as it were, and one which would have to accompany them everywhere they went. All the time, they had to have a Torah scroll by their side, because the most important thing to remember when you are put in a position of leadership is who is really in charge. So fascinating things in this week's Sedra. Covers a lot of different things. It talks about the different types of mystical practices that we are not allowed to indulge in. Things like speaking to the dead, necromancy, that is all forbidden in the Torah. And one thing's quite interesting, because we sometimes point out that the Torah doesn't talk much about life after death, so we don't really know what happens after we die. But here is, if you want, you could call it evidence from the Torah that there's clearly something that endures after a person passes from the world. Because if it was just the end of it, if that was it after a person died, then why would the Torah need to tell us that we can't communicate with dead people? So from here we actually learn an allusion to the fact that something does continue after our time in this physical world. So fascinating stuff. We also learn about prophets. Prophecy was another type of leadership for the Jewish people. We know from the Bible several of the high-profile prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah, but there would have been in excess of 1 million prophets living at different times of biblical history. And that's because prophecy, the ability to reach prophecy, was a question of a person's spiritual level, a person's being attuned to these spiritual realms and being able to receive prophecy. So actually, it was available to a great number of people, not just the kind of key prophets that we know made it into the big book. So that also gets discussed, and we talk about going out to war and the faith and the trust that the soldiers were supposed to have in Hashem when they went out to war. That gets discussed as well. And then the final thing that gets discussed is the procedure that would occur if a murder victim was found randomly in the middle of nowhere, and they didn't know who had killed him, and they didn't know where he had come from. So there was a whole process that was undertaken to try and place reasonable proximity to the nearest town or the nearest village, and they would assume culpability as a town for not having taken care of this individual enough. So interesting things to look into and interesting things to read up on for this week's Parashat. But that is pretty much what we're going to cover, unless we have some questions, which we do. Peter Hammerman, over to you. You are muted. We're going to have to unmute you, Peter.
May I ask something?
No, Peter's going to go first, Gary, I think. I'm sorry. He's just trying to get his microphone in order. There we are. Yes, we can. Sorry, Gary.
At the time of the king, what actually led the Jewish people? Would it have been the king, who presumably was a secular leader, or a religious leader?
So the ideal format is that the king would also be a religious figurehead. One thing we have to appreciate in the turbulent history of Jewish monarchy throughout the Bible, we had some good kings and we had some very, very bad kings. But what's interesting about all of these kings is that in many ways, 98% of the time, they were all tremendously Torah observant. They knew a lot about Torah observance. They were just mistakes that people made, or they got corrupted, or they worshipped idols, or whatever it might be. And I think we've talked in the past about a particular king who worshipped idols and was ridiculed by a particular rabbi in the Talmud. And this king appeared to him in a dream and said, like, you've got no idea. If you had lived at my time, you would have hiked up your tunic to run to worship idols. I at least had the decency to walk when I did it. So we're dealing with a time where there was a lot of sensitivity to halakha, to Torah observance. We had some good kings and we had some bad kings. And that was the tumultuous history of the Jews living in the land of Israel. But it should have been a holy figurehead to work, in tandem with the great rabbis who would have been the judges and the prophets and the other types of leaders, along with a very holy group of kohanim, of priests who would have served in the temple, and they would have also been of a high spiritual nature. So the ideal reality in the biblical sense is for everybody to have this awareness of Torah and halakha and all the rest of it. But as we know from reality now, and as we know from our biblical history, it's not always been like that. So
Okay.
that's the way it's been. Got it. Oh, sorry, go on.
No, I just said thank you.
Oh, you are most welcome, kind sir. Mr. Gary.
Yeah, I'm sorry, you just reminded me of something that struck me a week or two back in the Parashat of Appoint.
Right.
It says that thy raiment waxed not old upon thee. The shoes and the clothes didn't wear out.
Yeah.
Who's the commentator, Ibn Ezra?
He is, he's one of the commentators. I'll tell you exactly when he lived. Rabbi Gugelovich.
Because I'm not sure if he's saying it's true or it's not true. His comment is, with regard to that, there are some who explain this in the manner of a symbol. That is, the expressions are rhetorical and not to be understood in their literal sense. They are a vivid metaphor to denote the sustaining providence of God during the wanderings in the inhospitable desert. So is he saying that the clothes and shoes didn't wear out, or they may have done?
It sounds like he might be saying they may have done. But that's not, from what I've learned, that's not a kind of universal understanding. I think if the Torah says that their shoes and their clothes didn't wear out, it could well be understood on a literal basis as well. We always say that there's 70 faces to the Torah, and there's so much depth and so many messages that one can learn out from any verse or word or letter in the Torah. But we do also say that there is a superficial, literal understanding that is applied to the way the Torah is written as well. So it's just more research. It's just more research for you, Gary, isn't it? You know. So
now we're going that it didn't wear out.
Well, that's certainly one of the things that I had learned. So I wasn't there. So all right. So that is our Parashat for this week. And
I
now,
thought we were all there at Sinai.
pardon me, sorry.
I thought we were all there at Sinai, they say, don't they?
Well, our souls were there, but that I know that as a physical body, I have not lived for thousands of years. So
Have I?
yeah.
Stanley?
Hello, Stanley. One moment, Stanley. I'm so sorry.
Taylor got this twist.
Beautiful, darling.
I don't think you need to wear your mask if you're on your own.
In the days of what we call, say, high justice in these times, was there such a thing as people losing their citizenship or things like that?
People using their citizenship,
Losing their citizenship. Or any other form of very high justice without violence?
You mean as one of the punishments?
Yeah.
I'm not so certain. I'm not so certain of that. Not every mistake would have been punishable with the death penalty. There were fines that existed, and I mean maybe one close parallel would be if a person was in a situation where they couldn't afford to pay back something that they had stolen or something like that, so they may have been put into slavery until they were able to pay back the equivalent value of that which they had stolen. So we do see a concept like that in Jewish law. So could that equate to something that you're describing with a loss of citizenship? Maybe that's something relatively similar.
Weren't they outcasts sometimes? Just outcasts in the desert or wherever.
Yeah.
Well, that also exists. You could be exiled from a camp if you were spiritually impure. But that was only a temporary measure. But there are other things. You could be excommunicated if you were insistent on maintaining something that you were doing wrong. So there could have been instances of excommunication and banning from different places. So yeah, that existed as well. So all those kinds of things.
Without violence.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that you mentioned violence, because even if there was a situation where people may have been pursued for various reasons, if they had murdered someone, and then all of that family are now chasing after you to get their revenge. So there were places known as cities of refuge. There were 6 cities of refuge that a person could flee to, and no one would be allowed to harm them, and no one would be allowed to touch them. They would be absorbed by these cities, and they would offer protection to people who were on the run. So yeah, in that regards, that kind of thing may have existed. Would have existed, yeah.
Southern Spain today.
Pardon me?
Sounds like southern Spain today.
I can't make a comment on that. It's public. Who knows where this stuff gets outstanding? Got to be so careful with what we say online. Okay, so let's have a little go at Pirkei Avot for today. Here we go. Let's get it up on the screen for us. Come on. There we go. Pirkei Avot. We are in chapter 3 of Ethics of the Fathers. And we are on Mishnah 5. So can everybody see that on their screens?
We did that last week with Rabbi.
The one with the knife, yeah, with the knife, we did that one.
Really?
Yeah.
Just one.
What a cheeky monkey. Was it just the one that he did?
Yeah, just one.
Unbelievable. Good thing that we spent so long talking about the Parashat then. Don't want to be left with nothing to say. Okay, so that's good. So,
Number 6, Rabbi Nahunia.
lovely. All right. So yeah, number 5 on the screens. Number 6 probably in your books. So let's ask if anyone wants to read that out for us.
Peter will do it. No, you do it.
We can always count on you, Peter.
I'm the only one that can read.
Yeah.
Rabbi Nahunia ben Hannah said, whoever takes upon himself the yoke of the Torah, they remove from him the yoke of government and the yoke of worldly concerns, and whoever breaks off from himself the yoke of the Torah, they place upon him the yoke of government and the yoke of worldly concerns.
This is no yoking matter.
What's the word yoke means?
Oh.
It's a burden.
That's right. Yeah. So when you load up an animal ready for ploughing, you put a yoke on the animal's shoulders, and then the animal has to drag the whole thing that he's connected to with the help of the yoke. Quick riddle for you, Dad. You're not allowed to answer this one because I learnt it from you. If the how's it go? If joke is spelled Joke and folk is spelled FOLK, how do you spell the white of an egg? If joke is spelled Joke and folk is spelled FOLK, how do you spell the white of an egg?
What's the Hebrew word for yoke?
No, nothing to do with Hebrew. I'm just telling a joke. Oh, never mind. It's gone whoosh right over our heads. Never mind. All right. So Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakana Omer. Rabbi Nechunya, the son of Hakana, said, Kol hamakabel alav ol Torah. Rita, you were asking what the Hebrew word for a yoke is. The word is ol. Kol hamakabel alav ol Torah. Any person who takes upon himself the yoke of Torah, ma'avirin mimenu ol malchut v'ol derech eretz. They remove from him the yoke of government and the yoke of worldly concerns. V'chol ha'porek mimenu ol Torah. Anybody who distances themselves, who casts off the yoke of Torah from their shoulders, nosnin alav ol malchus v'ol derech eretz. Then they will place upon themselves the yoke of government, the yoke of worldly concerns. If you want, you can change that word to burden. The burden of Torah, the burden of government, the burden of worldly concerns. What's jumping out at you, and what are you thinking?
Well, they're the same thing. The one is positive, the one is negative.
Very good.
Exactly. Well, a yoke is to lead the animal in the right way.
Oh, excellent. Okay, so how are you going to tap that in?
But if you take it off, then it would not go. It would just wander into anyway.
Okay, so how are you? What are you applying? What's your takeaway message, Joe?
Well, that the Torah will lead you in the right way, but if you remove it, you won't know which way to go.
Okay. Anyone else want to chime in? Gary?
Well, are you allowed to break off from the yoke of the Torah?
Interesting. Are you allowed to break off from the yoke of Torah? Well, it's clearly, if it's saying it in the Mishnah, then it's clearly possible to break off from the yoke of Torah. Whether or not it's allowed, we have to, we can discuss that. What do people think?
But we're saying that you can have a person in government, but he doesn't have to be, for want of a better word, religious.
So that you can what with a person in government?
You can have a person in government who, to all intents and purposes, is not religious.
Right.
Is that what he's saying?
So you're interpreting it as a person who takes on the yoke of government. You're interpreting that as somebody who works for the government.
Yeah, works for the government. He has no interest in religion.
Okay, it's an interesting take.
I think it's saying that you can't do both.
All right, talk us through that, Paul.
Surprising.
Why do you find that surprising?
Because I think Torah is because of the laws involved in Torah. If you're going to keep Torah, you need to have a system of governance, which you can call government, but you can't have a people without any governance. And you can't have Torah without understanding some of the worldly concerns of the people who the Torah is aimed at. The three must stay together, yet here he's saying clearly they can't.
Well, here you're interpreting it as clearly they can't. So that might not be what the Mishnah is trying to tell us. But if we've got no other people that want to jump in, then we can start going through some of the messages and some of the thoughts. Anyone else got anything they want?
It seems to be separating government from religion.
Okay, and what does that do for us?
Like Paul said, I find that a bit surprising.
Okay, good. This is all excellent. Let's delve into this a little bit and see what content we can pour into this. So first of all, we've got this Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakana, and he lived at the time of the Second Temple. Not only that, but he actually survived to see the destruction of the Second Temple and the period of time after that. So he saw everything that was going on. And so he injects all of that life experience into these words over here. So fundamentally, when I was looking into this, I was discovering the following. There's an approach, really. When we talk about yoke, so first of all, I'll say this. In the interpretations that I saw, we weren't really saying that we're talking about someone who works in government or anything like that. When we talk about carrying a yoke, it was more along the lines of we have only a finite amount of headspace. Could you just give me 1 second? I just want to see if I can mute the children a little bit. Sorry, just a little bit of background noise coming in that was being a bit distracting. So we all carry yokes. We all have things that occupy our head spaces. We all have priorities in life. We all have perspectives and things that we're constantly trying to balance in our lives. the burdens of daily life, the burdens of making a living, the burdens of how that fits into the greater societal and the greater world picture. And sometimes there are people who just let, what's the phrase? We have the weight of the world on our shoulders. Yeah? Everyone familiar with that phrase? Having the weight of the world on their shoulders. So broadly speaking, what this seems to be driving at is a message to not have the weight of the world on our shoulders. Because we've only got a finite amount really that we can deal with. So in that through that lens, what are you going to allow into your mind? It actually ties into this week's Parashat. The beginning of this week's Parashat Shoftim, it says, Shoftim v'shotrim, what does it say? You should appoint guards and policemen to all of your gates. That is what the Parasha starts off by saying. Let's get the wording so that I don't... I'm terrible at remembering verses off by heart, but Shoftim v'shotrim titen lecha. There we go. Shoftim v'shotrim titen lecha b'chol sha'arecha. Just judges and officers shall you appoint in all of your sha'arecha, which is your gates, your gateways. It means to make sure that in every city, in every town, you've got a justice system in place, you've got a system of police in place. That's the literal understanding of that verse. But the metaphysical and the psychological interpretation of these words is that in all of your gates, meaning every opening that you have in your body that absorbs things, that allows things in, you have to have judges and policemen waiting at those gates. So our ears are a gateway into our bodies, our mouths are a gateway into our body, our noses are a gateway into our body, and our eyes are a gateway into our body. So at all of these gateways, we have to make sure that we have things in place to filter, to censor, to veto, to push away any influence that is going to be detrimental to our emotional, physical, and psychological well-being. So the things that we let in, the things that we allow ourselves to see, the things that we allow ourselves to say, the things that we allow ourselves to eat, the things that we allow ourselves to hear, they have to be monitored by us. Because otherwise, if we let everything in, then we're just going to get overwhelmed and we're not going to have any direction and we're not going to have any perspective. So the Mishnah is saying, and Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakana is saying, that if you've got a choice of what you're going to let in, if you've got a choice of the priorities that you're going to live by, then let your priority be Torah. Let the yoke of Torah, let that be. Joe was referring to a yoke being the guiding mechanism that an animal has to drag along to be able to find direction. So let the Torah be what is resting on you at all times to help you navigate and to move through life. And don't let the burdens of the rest of the world essentially weigh you down, drag you down, confuse you, set you off target, set you off your goals in life. So that is, broadly speaking, that is the message that's emerging from this Mishnah. I'm sure we'll all be familiar with the story of the college professor. I think it is a bit apocryphal, this story, because you hear it in all kinds of variations, but the story goes something like this. There's a college professor who comes in to the class one day and he's delivering his lecture, and he puts on the table, he puts on an empty jar, and then he takes out several golf balls and he pours the golf balls into that jar. And he says to his class, okay, hands up in the room, who thinks this jar is now full? So everyone puts their hands up. Well, look, that whole jar is now full with golf balls. So then he takes out a bag of pebbles and he pours in pebbles, and the class watch as the pebbles start to find their way through all of the little gaps and all of the little air spaces that the golf balls were leaving. And then he says to the class, okay, who thinks the jar is now full? And you see everyone put their hands up. It's now full with golf balls and pebbles. And then he takes out a bag of sand and he pours the sand into the jar. And then the class watches as the sand penetrates and goes through all of the cracks and all of the air spaces that the pebbles and the golf balls had left behind. And then he says, hands up who thinks the jar is full now. And then they all put up their hands and they say, yeah, okay, it's clearly by now the jar must be full. So he explained that they each represent different things. The golf balls represent the things in life that are extremely, extremely important, that we just cannot live without. That is going to be things like, the air that we breathe, the water that we drink, the food that we eat. Those are going to be the core essentials that we really, really must have. You cannot survive without these things. The pebbles, he says, represent all of those important relationships that we need to try and foster in our lifetimes. The relationships with our parents, the relationships with our friends, the relationships with our spouses, with our children, whoever it may be, our colleagues, our employees, our employers. All of those important relationships that a person needs to have in place, those are represented by the pebbles. And then he says the sand represents all of the luxuries in life, all of the fancy cars, all the fancy holidays, all of the beautiful homes, the luxury yachts, all of those things that, the nice clothes, all of the materialistic things that you don't really need, but are very nice if they're filling in all of the gaps left by your golf balls and by your pebbles. But then he poured everything out, and then he took the sand and he filled up the jar entirely with sand. And then he says, if all you do is you fill your life with sand, then how are you going to fit in the pebbles and how are you going to fit in the golf balls? And everyone's like, ooh, how profound. Yeah? So when we understand our perspectives, when we understand our priorities in life, the most important things that we have to focus on, right? So we understand that we have to prioritize our golf balls first, and we've got to make sure that we can literally live, right? Eat and drink and all the rest of it. We have to then make sure that our relationships are strong and that we are in the right places and in the right emotional settings and we're letting the right things in. And then after that, we can fill all of our gaps with the sand and all of those luxuries and pleasures in life that are intended to fill those other gaps. But if all we do is just fill our lives with indulgence and fill our lives with luxury and fill our lives with things that we think are going to give us happiness and think are going to give us pleasure, then we'll have no other space for the things that are important in life. I'll pause there just to see if anyone has anything to say, and then I'll continue after that with a couple more insights.
I always thought, it's Rita speaking,
Hello,
I always
Rita.
thought the word burden is a bit negative, isn't it? I've got burden. It's really something I have to do, but I really don't want to do.
Absolutely.
So am I right? So they used the word yoke and was translated to burden for me, because I never heard that word before.
Yeah.
And to me it's a bit like a burden is something, you're doing it because you have to do it.
Yeah.
Or you're not obliged. Obviously nobody's going to shoot you not doing it, but something you have to do because it's something probably somebody's expecting you to do.
So the answer is it's going to depend, as is so often the case as an answer in Judaism, is it depends. Yeah. So if we think about an animal having to carry a yoke, okay, so we're talking about a strong animal who, by having the yoke on their shoulders, it actually maximizes their potential in this world. right? An animal can graze in a field and not really accomplish very much. If you put a yoke which is connected to a plow, yeah, and then that animal is now moving along this field, and behind him he is actually cultivating the soil and preparing it for growth and all the rest of it. So the very fact that it is now connected to this yoke means that it can actually contribute to the world, can actually be a source of benefit and a source of blessing to the world, but it can only do that because it's connected to this yoke, right? If you were to attach a heavy plow to a child or even to an adult, and you were to then say, right, go and plow this field, right, they're going to struggle, they're going to collapse, it's going to break them, because that yoke is too heavy for a human being to bear. It's not too heavy for an animal to bear. In fact, the opposite. It's precisely that yoke that allows the animal to move and to flourish and to contribute and to be successful. So a burden that allows us to be directed and focused and move in the right direction, that's not really a burden. That's the positive connotation of the word yoke, right? So the yoke of Torah is intended that helps us move, might make us move at a slower pace. It might restrict our movement somewhat, but any steps that we do take are going to be filled with blessing and filled with blossoming and allows us to flourish within the framework of the Torah. It actually allows us to bring our potential to the surface. If that burden is too heavy, then it's going to crush us. But as I've heard on a number of occasions from a rabbi in New York called Rabbi Y.Y. Jacobson, who I really, really love to listen to, right? If you are being crushed by the yoke of Torah, then you might need to check whether you're carrying the right yoke. Because he says the yoke of Torah is not there to crush us, and it's not there to diminish us, and it's not there to squash us, right? If we're being squashed by it, then we're doing it wrong. That's the point that he makes. If we are actually feeling like our soul is soaring and our soul is reaching higher places, and we are feeling fulfilled emotionally and spiritually and psychologically, if that's all going right, then we know that we're heading in the right direction with the yoke of Torah. It's not there to squash us and to burn us down. Yeah.
The wording.
Yeah.
It may just be a translation.
Yeah. Yeah.
It just says, takes upon himself the yoke of Torah. They remove from him the yoke of government.
Where is that on our screen?
Sorry?
Let me just have a look. Yeah. Okay. Very good. So it's not necessarily a bad translation, because I'll tell you why. This was something else that I was coming to. Once upon a time, can you close the door, please? Is that for me?
Yeah.
Thank you, my darling. Can you make sure the doors are closed on both sides? Oh, I'll take this one. Sorry, everyone. So once upon a time, the way in which the society would work was that if you were a Torah leader, if you were a teacher of Torah or a leader of a community, the rest of the community would actually cover your taxes, and they would cover your bills, and they would alleviate a lot of the mundane activities that we all get involved in. They would actually be shouldered by the rest of the community to allow the rabbi to just sit and learn and teach and guide and be a spiritual mentor for everybody in the community. So actually, according to that understanding, when it tells us that they remove the yoke of worldly responsibilities and the yoke of government, it's talking quite literally as well. they, the rest of the community, would take away these other responsibilities, because they would want their rabbi to sit and just be, and not be bothered by these things.
Thank you. So
I look forward to those days, Paul. Yeah, go on, Peter.
in this context, does government mean leadership?
One second, let's hear what Peter has to say first.
So in this context, does government does government mean leadership, or is it some other meaning?
So, from what I can see, for what I've seen and for what I've understood, the yoke of government, certainly at the time of the Second Temple, is talking about the burden of taxes. It's talking about the burden of the uncertainty and the threat from being in a difficult society and having difficult leaders. You know, all of the well, they didn't call it anti-Semitism then, did they? But all of the attacks and the threats to the Jewish nation, that is what this Rabbi Nechemia ben Hakana, was having to live through. So back then it was not just the burden of leadership that we're talking about. It's the burden of having to deal with an oppressive government or an oppressive regime. So that's a big part of what he's talking about as well. But even though that might have been more relevant then, I think the relevance for us and the messages for us is that we all have things that we care about in life. We all have things that we worry about in life. And so the message is, and this is something that the Chafetz Chaim talks about, is that it makes more sense for us to carry the burden, the yoke of the spiritual struggles in life, which ultimately lead to blessing and to happiness and to meaning, rather than for us to fill our heads with the mundane worries, which can drain us emotionally and don't really offer much in return. You know, so when I was writing on the Facebook group to advertise this lunch and learn, so I said, as one of our discussion questions, let me just check what I wrote actually. That's probably a better idea because I can't remember. But it was along the lines of, like, what should we be filling our heads with, basically? What should our focuses and our priorities be in life? If we are constantly worrying about what's happening in Madagascar and Senegal, and you know, we're reading the paper every day and we're just feeling this weight of, oh my gosh, the world is going completely to pot in countries that are so remote and so far away, but we're feeling all of those pressures. So on the one hand, we could argue it's a wonderful thing because we're feeling the plight of fellow mankind. But on the other hand, if we only have a finite amount of resources and a finite amount of things that we can invest emotionally and psychologically, etc., so we have to give some thought as to what works for us. And we have to give some thought as to really what we need to have as our priorities and our focuses in life. And that's going to be different for each and every single person. So that is a big chunk of what I see as a message from this Mishnah. Anyone else got contrary opinions, or?
I think in reality, there are few of us who have the ability to take on the yoke of Torah in the way that the rabbis discussed it. Therefore, what we take from your teachings is a level of responsibility, social responsibility, governmental, world concern. It's not unreasonable for us to do that. I see where you're coming from, but this is a bit of a Gorish, as my father would have said. This is a bit of either go for the Torah road and drop everything else, or go for the rest of the world and deal with it in a Torah manner, being guided by Torah principles. And I'm all for the Torah principles and the guidance, because that's what we have to live by. I can't think of a way that I could extricate myself from my family and my responsibilities to take on, as the rabbis imply, the yoke of Torah, and actually dumping the government of worldly concerns. I just don't.
Is it? That's it. There was one thing that you mentioned before, though. You also mentioned about casting off the family responsibilities, didn't you?
Well, there is X amount of time, as you put it, to deal with everything.
Yeah.
And what comes first? All of that can be guided by what you're teaching us from the Torah. The family,
Yeah, so that was the point I was just going to come back to you on, which was that
here it's not guided at all. Here it's law of law. Just go for it. Go for the yoke of Torah. But the yoke of government and the yoke of worldly concerns will be taken care of by the other community because you're studying Torah almost on their behalf, and therefore that's why they're willing to pay for it.
Yeah.
And I just see this and I think, I don't know how. I think it's great. I think it's really interesting, but I'm not sure how we can.
Yeah. So
what the rabbis asked.
Yeah. So I do agree with you in that way, in the sense that when we were talking about how historically they would have literally lifted these other priorities or these different other responsibilities that would have been lifted from the rabbi. So I said that was very much how it may have used to be. I can assure you now from the number of bills that I get, as opposed to the number of bills that the shul gets on my behalf, that reality has changed. But what I do feel is that when it comes to most of the things and most of the concerns that we have in our lives, and you were alluding to family responsibilities and that kind of thing, I do think that still comes under this old Torah. Yeah, we have a responsibility to raise a family, and the question is, what is going to be the yoke that we put on our shoulders as we try and raise a family? Is it going to be the yoke of Torah? Is that what we're going to use to drive us forward, or is it going to be influences that come from the outside? It's a horrible example to bring because we're all, all of us young families are all living through the same kind of thing, but it gets discussed in society, so I don't see why I shouldn't also have the right to mention it as well. When we wake up in the morning and when our kids wake up in the morning, do we just say, right, well, this is a burden I'm not willing to shoulder, so I will chuck them in front of the TV and I'll let Peppa Pig educate my children? Or do we say that actually I have a responsibility as a parent that I have to help steer my children's education? So in many ways, that's where I see the relevance of this Mishnah coming to the surface. Is that, do we just kind of cast off any Jewish responsibility for how we live our lives and how we help others in the world, or the contributions that we make, the outlook that we have, the focus that we have, the targets that we make for our lives, the things that we strive for, the places that we want to get to in life, do we try and make those judgments with the support of the Torah and Judaism and a Jewish perspective on our shoulders, or are those decisions made for us by what we have imbibed from society and from the cultures around us? Yeah. So that's very much where I see the kind of relevance for today from this Mishnah. Because if we take upon ourselves to be guided and to shape our lives based on the Torah, that's going to look profoundly different from making our decisions based on things that we see in the news, based on the TV programs that we watch, based on the ideals that we might watch and see on YouTube blogs and things like that. Because the danger is that if we're constantly trying to live someone else's life, then we're not going to find satisfaction, we're not going to find fulfillment, we're not going to find meaning, we're not going to find happiness, because we're trying to live in a way that is not actually going to allow us to fulfill our potential, and it's not actually going to channel us and direct us and focus us in a way that is conducive to our growth and to our happiness and to our well-being. It's instead going to just weigh down on us if we're constantly looking for things that are not necessarily meant for us. So that's very much where I see this.
Rabbi, can I,
Ooh,
Rabbi,
I'll let you and Rita fight it out.
Rita, you know, you talk about these golf balls.
Yeah.
Are the golf balls the Torah studies? These golf balls, is that the one we should, like you said, you were eating and everything, you know, everything that's important? Or are you putting this, the Torah, with the golf ball?
So I would put it definitely with the golf balls and with the pebbles as well. You know, or maybe one could say like this: the jar is the Torah. You know, the jar is you know, we are the jar. The Torah is the jar. The idea is that in this life, which is going to bring us meaning and fulfillment and pleasure, etc., what are we going to fill that with?
So we need everything.
So we do need everything, but if we start in the wrong direction, then we're going to find that we're not feeling very accomplished and we're not feeling full in the right way. So we've got to always make sure that we have our our foundations in place, and once our foundations in place, then that helps us navigate the world, and then on top of that can be the Lamborghinis and the and things like that.
Whatever, yeah.
But yeah, I mean the golf balls are all shaped by having a realistic understanding of who we are, what we need. You know, it's the things that we need in life. We need to eat. We need to drink. We need to be guided by the Torah 100%. The pebbles, we need to have relationships. We need to have meaningful connections in our lives. But we shouldn't make the mistake of filling our whole jar with sand, because we're never going to be happy. We're never going to be satisfied. So yeah.
Very good. Yeah.
All right. That's all we've got time for this week, ladies and gentlemen. If you want to join us for the after party on Zoom, you're welcome to do so. We're going to turn off the recording now. So come join us for the lively banter and all of the secrets that we haven't shared with you on the recording here. Come join us on Zoom. But apart from that, we wish you all a meaningful, wonderful day. The Shabbat Shalom for when it comes. And we look forward to seeing you next week.